Selma, Oregon, July 4th, 1983. A warm summer night. Fireworks cracking in the distance. Laughter echoing through the trees. But before the night was over, a young woman named Teresa Peroni would walk into the forest with her boyfriend and vanish forever. The party in the woods. The celebration was tucked deep into the rural outskirts of Josephine County, Oregon. Friends had gathered at a remote property near Deer Creek Road, just outside the quiet, wooded community of Selma. They were there to enjoy the 4th of July. Music, alcohol, a campfire under the stars. 27-year-old Teresa Peroni arrived with her boyfriend, Mark Sanfratello, who was a few years older and known around town. The two had been dating for a while, but their relationship had its tensions. Friends described it as volatile, sometimes loving, sometimes explosive. As the evening wore on, those tensions started to show. Witnesses recalled raised voices. An argument was unfolding between Teresa and Mark. Then, sometime around nightfall, the two walked off together into the nearby woods, into the darkness. That was the last time anyone saw Teresa Peroni alive. Mark returned alone. His explanation? Vague, unsettling. He claimed they'd argued and she stormed off, that she wanted to be alone, that she'd come back when she was ready. But Teresa never did. Her purse, her belongings, her car, everything was left behind. Friends immediately felt something was wrong. This wasn't like her. A missing persons report was filed. Search teams scoured the area for days, on foot with dogs and by helicopter. Nothing. There were no screams, no blood, no torn clothing. Just empty woods and a boyfriend who said, "I don't know where she went." The initial investigation. Investigators with the Josephine County Sheriff's Office launched a formal missing persons case. Their primary focus, Mark Sanfratello. He had been the last person seen with Teresa. His story was inconsistent, investigators noted. And when pressed, his behavior was described as calm, almost too calm. But there was a problem. No body, no crime scene, no witnesses. Without physical evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. In 1983, forensic tools were limited. DNA was still years away from becoming a viable investigative tool. And with no remains, prosecutors had nothing solid to work with. So the case went cold. The woman the town forgot. As the years passed, Teresa's name faded from public memory. Her photo sat in old files. Her family, desperate for answers, eventually moved away. But in Josephine County, investigators never completely closed the case. Every few years, a detective would take another look at the file. A cold case, a woman who vanished without a trace, and a man who never gave a clear answer. Still, without a body, the case was stuck. Investigators feared they'd never find closure. A quiet rumor. Among locals, there were whispers. Some believed Mark had done something terrible. Others thought Teresa had run off. But those who knew her, really knew her, never believed that. She was quiet but steady, independent but not reckless. She loved her family. She wouldn't have disappeared willingly. Her family described her as having a gentle heart. She had dreams, simple ones, a future, a life. It was stolen. And Mark Sanfratello? He moved away quietly, eventually settling in Chico, California. No arrest, no trial, no answers, just silence. But 14 years later, in 1997, something would be found. A discovery buried in the woods, where Teresa was last seen, and it would change everything. 1997. The forest gives up a secret. It was late summer 1997, when a local resident hiking near Deer Creek Road, just outside Selma, Oregon, stumbled upon something strange partially buried in the dirt. At first, it looked like a rock, but as they got closer, it was unmistakable. A human skull. The area was isolated, wooded, quiet. The same forest where Teresa Peroni had vanished 14 years earlier. The skull was intact, but heavily weathered. No clothing, no personal items. No ID, only a single, chilling question. Who did it belong to? A dead end in the 90s. The Josephine County Sheriff's Office brought the skull in. Forensics experts examined it, trying to determine gender, age, and time of death. Their best estimate was female, likely in her 20s or 30s. Skull showed no obvious trauma, but there was a problem. In 1997, DNA testing was in its infancy. There was no centralized database, no easy way to compare the skull to known missing persons. So despite the location, less than 3 miles from the last place Teresa was seen, investigators couldn't prove it was her. They had to store the skull as evidence, label it Jane Doe, and hope for a future breakthrough. For the second time, the case froze over. 2 more decades of silence. From 1997 to 2023, over 25 years, the skull sat in an evidence locker. Forensics advanced. DNA got better. National databases like CODIS and NAMUS were born. But Teresa's name wasn't linked. Her remains weren't in the system. Her family didn't know the skull existed. And Mark Sanfratello? He was still living in California. Quiet, free, unbothered. The case of Teresa Peroni had become a whisper of a mystery, forgotten by time, until 2024. 2024, the breakthrough. That year, Oregon's Cold Case Task Force began re-examining unidentified remains across the state using modern DNA profiling and genetic genealogy. The skull found in 1997 was one of the cases submitted for analysis. This time, the sample quality was strong. And this time, there was a match. The DNA came back to the Peroni family. After over 40 years, investigators had finally confirmed what they had long suspected. The skull belonged to Teresa Peroni. She had never left. She'd been in those woods all along. Reopening the case, with the identity confirmed, the Oregon Department of Justice, along with the Josephine County Sheriff's Office, reactivated the case as a homicide. Why? Because the circumstances of her death, last seen alive with Mark Sanfratello, who returned alone, and her remains found hidden nearby, were far too suspicious. They interviewed old witnesses, re-examined testimony, pieced together the timeline from 1983, what was said, what wasn't, and what never quite added up. And after 4 decades of waiting, the case was finally presented to a grand jury. June 27, 2025, indictment issued. After reviewing all the evidence, past and present, a Josephine County grand jury indicted Mark Sanfratello on second-degree murder charges. The case was ready. The state had its proof, a confirmed identity of the victim, a last known witness, a motive rooted in conflict, a location that matched perfectly. Now it was time to bring Mark in. June 28, 2025, arrest in California. At 72 years old, Mark Sanfratello was living a quiet life in Chico, California. But on the morning of June 28, police arrived at his door. The man who once walked out of the Oregon forest without Teresa was placed under arrest, accused of murdering her 4 decades earlier. He offered no resistance, just silence. Sanfratello was booked in Butte County and held while extradition orders were processed to send him back to Oregon. A missing woman, a skull in the woods, and now, an accused killer finally in cuffs. But this story isn't over. Because what happens when a 42-year-old crime hits a modern courtroom? He walked into the woods with her in 1983, returned alone, said nothing. For 42 years, he lived a free man, until a single piece of bone, buried under moss and soil, changed everything. Now, Mark Sanfratello faces the one thing he thought he'd outrun: justice. June 28, 2025, arrested in Chico. It was just past dawn in Chico, California. A 72-year-old man was sitting in his home, quiet, retired. Life had moved on. But outside, officers from Butte County were moving in, backed by an Oregon warrant. The charges, second-degree murder. Mark Sanfratello was taken into custody without incident. No visible resistance. No comments. But his face, described by one officer, looked like a man who knew this was coming. He just didn't know when. Extradition to Oregon. On July 8, 2025, Sanfratello was extradited to Josephine County, Oregon. The man who left Oregon all those years ago was now back in handcuffs, escorted to the same region where Teresa Peroni had died, back to the place where the story began, and where it now had a chance to end. He was booked into the Josephine County Jail, held without bail. The charge, unlawfully and recklessly causing the death of Teresa Peroni, with extreme indifference to the value of human life. That single sentence, 40 years in the making, now hung over him like a shadow. July 10th, 2025, the courtroom. Sanfratello appeared before a Josephine County Circuit Court judge, dressed in a beige jail jumpsuit, shackled at the waist. Stoic, the courtroom was tense. Reporters filled the back row. A few former friends of Teresa Peroni sat in silence. Some wiped away tears. Sanfratello entered a plea of not guilty. His defense attorney said he had no comment for the press, but made it clear, "My client maintains his innocence. This was a tragic disappearance, not a homicide." But the Oregon Department of Justice wasn't backing down. They had the DNA. They had the timeline. They had the story. And now they had the man. The power of forensic time travel. What changed everything wasn't confession or a new witness. It was forensic science. The skull found in 1997, stored, tagged, and largely forgotten, had waited until 2024, when advanced DNA technology could extract a viable profile. It was matched to Teresa's biological relatives using genealogical mapping. The location of the skull matched perfectly with the wooded area where she was last seen, and there were no other known missing women from that area or time who matched her profile. There was only one logical conclusion. She never left those woods alive. Prosecutors' case strategy. Sources close to the case say the Oregon DOJ is pursuing the theory that Teresa and Mark had a violent argument during the party on July 4th, 1983. Mark led her into the woods, possibly under the guise of cooling off or talking. Something happened, a physical confrontation that turned deadly. Teresa's body was then hidden, possibly buried under leaves or shallow soil. Mark said nothing, returned to the party, and left town days later. They planned to rely on historical witness statements from the 1983 party, inconsistencies in Sanfratello's account of that night, the geographic proximity of the remains, and the timeline of his actions after her disappearance. This won't be a case built on fingerprints or bloody clothes. It's a case built on absence of action, of truth, of a body until now. Who is Mark Sanfratello? Not much is publicly known about his life after Oregon. He reportedly moved to Chico in the late 1980s, held a series of odd jobs, kept to himself. No criminal record, no known outbursts, just a man with a quiet past and a buried secret. Some neighbors described him as pleasant. Others said he gave off a weird vibe. But no one imagined the truth, that he had once been at the center of a missing person case that ended in a shallow grave. Teresa's family reacts. Teresa Peroni's surviving relatives were notified before the arrest was made public. They issued a short, emotional statement. "We've waited 42 years for answers. We never stopped loving her, and we never stopped hoping the truth would come out. We are grateful to the investigators who never gave up. We now pray for justice." Their heartbreak, frozen in 1983, was finally beginning to thaw, but the road ahead would be painful. What happens next? Sanfratello is now awaiting trial in Oregon. A pre-trial hearing is expected later this summer, with the prosecution preparing a full timeline and a potential witness list from the original party. Authorities are still asking for help. If you attended the July 4th, 1983 party near Deer Creek Road, and remember anything, no matter how small, please come forward. This is your chance to help write the end of Teresa's story. A skull buried for decades, a man who kept his silence, and a justice system now armed with science and memory. But the trial is coming, and Sanfratello's defense has one final play. Convince the jury that there's no proof of murder, only disappearance. A skull hidden for decades, a man who stayed silent for 42 years, and a courtroom now filled with ghosts from the past. This is a final fight for justice in the case of Teresa Peroni and her accused killer, Mark Sanfratello, the challenge of a cold case trial. By the time the case reached court in 2025, one thing was clear. This wouldn't be a typical murder trial. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime. There was no cause of death, just a skull found in the same woods where Teresa vanished. And there was no confession. Not then, not now, but prosecutors believed they had something stronger. Time, DNA, and motive. And most importantly, Mark Sanfratello's silence for over 4 decades. Inside the courtroom was tense. Every seat filled. In the gallery, reporters, retired detectives, and members of the community who still remembered the quiet young woman who vanished in 1983. The prosecution, led by the Oregon Department of Justice, opened with a simple message. He was the last person to see Teresa alive. She walked into the woods with him and never came back. He left her there, and he's never told us why. They displayed a map of the area where the 1997 skull was found, less than 3 miles from the 1983 party site, in the same dense forest. They played audio of past witness statements from the party, people recalling an argument between Mark and Teresa, others noting he came back alone, looking agitated but not surprised. They showed the skull, now confirmed by DNA evidence to be Teresa's, as the centerpiece of their timeline. The defense's argument: no proof of murder, but Sanfratello's defense team came prepared. Their argument: this is a tragic disappearance, not a homicide. You have no murder weapon, no confession, not even cause of death. You only have a body found in the woods 14 years later, and a man who couldn't stop it. They attacked the age of the evidence. Memories fade. Witnesses contradict themselves. And Teresa could have gotten lost, injured, or fallen victim to someone else. They told the jury, the state wants you to fill in the blanks with suspicion, but suspicion is not proof. They emphasized that Sanfratello had never been arrested before, had lived peacefully for decades, and had not fled the country. He simply moved. The courtroom was split, the role of DNA and circumstantial evidence. The trial hinged on a key truth. DNA identified the skull as Teresa's, and the place it was found matched where she was last seen. With him, though there was no trauma visible on the skull, prosecutors argued that didn't matter. A person doesn't bury themselves in the woods and vanish for 42 years. Something happened, and only one person knew what that was: Mark Sanfratello. The jury was shown the timeline. July 4th, 1983. Teresa and Mark argue, walk into the woods. Mark returns alone. Teresa never seen again. Skull found in 1997, confirmed as Teresa in 2024. Sanfratello arrested in 2025. A powerful moment came when a retired deputy took the stand and said, "We always suspected it was him. We just couldn't prove it back then. But we knew, everyone knew." Teresa's voice in the courtroom. Teresa's sister gave a victim impact statement. Her voice cracked. She held up a photo from 1983, a bright-eyed young woman, unaware that her final hours were counting down. She was kind, she was smart, and she didn't deserve to be forgotten in the woods like trash. We waited 42 years to bring her home. Now we ask for justice. The courtroom fell silent. Even Sanfratello reportedly looked down during the statement. The jury's dilemma. Deliberations began after closing arguments. The jury was told, "You don't need to know exactly how she died. You only need to believe, beyond reasonable doubt, that he caused it." The defense repeated, "No body, no trauma, no direct evidence. You cannot convict a man on speculation." It was truth versus doubt, memory versus time, justice versus silence. The jury is still out. No verdict yet. No justice delivered. Not yet, but for the first time in 42 years, the truth has a voice and the silence is breaking. Underscore, and when the verdict comes down, so will the world watching.